Welcome to the Scholar's Chair. This program will explore the writings of 14th century philosopher Ibn Khaldun. There is a social, educational, and economic crisis in modern-day America. Perhaps we can find inspiration from 14th century philosopher Ibn Khaldun by reviewing his writings on the rise and fall of the Muslim civilization of Al-Andalusia. Americans' newspapers report daily problems, like Wall Street financial groups, that continue to deteriorate because of mismanagement and greed. American manufacturing moving abroad to increase profits. The educational system is non-responsive to the needs of students. Family life is dissolving into public chaos. Religious institutions are overwhelmed by moral uncertainty. According to history, issues of modern-day America are not new. Like modern-day America, Al-Andalusia was a beacon of learning, and its capital city, Cordoba, was one of the leading cultural and economic centers in both the Mediterranean basin and the developing world. At that time, there was no United States of America, and Europe was a developing continent. The evolution of the ancient Muslim civilization of Al-Andalusia was observed by Khaldun and recorded in the celebrated 6-volume book called the Muqaddimah, the Introduction to History. It responded to the questions why and how this ancient civilization became successful and ultimately why it declined. The principles that govern and stabilize this great civilization are illustrated in philosophical discourse as well as historical facts by one of the great scholars of the 14th century. His writings are regarded among modern scholars as being a major foundational pillar for the establishment of universal education, sociology, political and economic sciences. According to Bruce B. Lawrence, director of the Islamic Center at Duke University, who wrote the introduction to Franz Rosenthal's translation of the Muqaddimah, Khaldun was considered the greatest statesman, jurist, historian, and scholar of his time. He was born in Tunis on May 27, 1332, the descendant of an aristocratic family who for several centuries enjoyed great prominence in the political leadership of Moorish Spain, then immigrated to Northwest Africa a few years before the fall of Seville into the hands of the Europeans in 1248. His immediate ancestors, all accomplished courtiers and scholars, were attached to the Hassid rulers of Tunis. His passion of learning and intellectual pursuits, for which his father and grandfather were noted, coupled with the political aspirations that fired a long line of his Moorish forebears, produced the rare combination of philosopher and scholar that we find in Ibn Khaldun. His early education followed traditional lines. He was a tutor in the Quran, the Holy Scripture for Muslims, the Hadith, history of the Prophet, jurisprudence, and the subtleties of Arabic poetry, and grammar by some of the best-known scholars of the time. He later applied himself to the study of Arab mysticism and philosophy of the Moorish Aristotelians. His formative years reconciled with the period from 1357 to 1374, a time of great political upheaval in Northwest Africa. He completed his education and met with the eminent scholars of the day. It was this contact with many cultural influences, as well as his intellectual versatility, that prevented him from specializing in any of the established disciplines. Fortunately, he was gifted with a rare insight that enabled him to penetrate the essentials of accumulated knowledge so that when he was ripe for his destined task, he was able to review historical experiences on a universal scale and to make his lasting contribution to the study of history. Khaldun's philosophy is relevant to modern thinkers because of how he defines human societies, their natural evolution, and decline over time. His philosophy first establishes the human beings as rational creatures who are obligated to cooperate with each other as a means of survival. Armed with this information, leaders of institutions and society can maximize productivity and prosperity, as well as minimize non-productivity and poverty. It is suggested by his writings that if we in American society can inform the natural conditions that create society, we may be able to better manage the ups and downs of markets and create the knowledge in order to do so. The human struggle to fulfill basic needs must seek cooperation with others. The subject matter of his book gives readers the opportunity to refine their thoughts about rational cooperation for survival. One aspect of Khaldun's philosophy is the importance to understand the convergence of science, philosophy, and religion in order to formulate practical knowledge. He does not, for example, place science in one corner and religion in another, but rather integrate them. This foundation of knowledge is found in both classical and Islamic thought. This is important because today students do not experience subjects fused together in this way. A good example of fusion between science and religion can be found in Khaldun's writings on the rational human being in chapter 6 of the Muqaddimah as translated by Franz Lowenthal. Khaldun writes, on man's ability to think, which distinguishes human beings from animals and enables them to obtain their livelihood, he admonishes to cooperate to this end with his fellow men and to study the Master, God, whom they worship, and the revelations that the messengers transmitted from him. God thus caused all animals to obey man and to be in the grasp of his power. Through his ability to think, God gave man superiority over many of his creatures. The rational aspect of human beings is the foundational attribute for cooperation in human society. It is a defining human characteristic which Khaldun declares as pivotal and builds a great deal of his historical instructions on this foundation. Khaldun writes, God distinguishes man from all other animals by an ability to think, which he, God, made the beginning of his human perfection and the end of man's noble superiority over existing things. One of the objectives of rational thought is cooperation with others, which is a universal value. In our interconnected global modern societies, Khaldun's ideas of rational cooperation for the benefit of all is growing increasingly important for human survival. Dr. Zaid Ahmed, senior lecturer in philosophy and civilization studies at University of Putra, Malaysia, in his book Epistemology of Ibn Khaldun, states Khaldun's idea that cooperation is important for the establishment of society. The ability to think enables the human being to find ways of making a living and to establish cooperation. Khaldun has proposed quite convincingly a very basic social concept which corresponds very closely to modern social theory of the division of labor. The main objective of man's thinking ability are to find ways to make a living and the establishment of a society. Logical sequence of the process can be understood quite clearly. However, the relationship between cooperation and the establishment of society need to be explained further. The term cooperation cannot simply be taken literally to mean helping each other. Cooperation at this juncture has to be understood as representing an important social concept and, of course, an important social process. The logic of this concept is quite straightforward. Man cannot live without food. In order to produce food, he needs to undergo a certain process and carry out a series of efforts. However, the effort of one single individual is not sufficient to obtain food for the entire community. As we see in modern times, there are large industries dedicated to food production. Modern men and women forget that the true wealth first starts from human effort to fulfill a single requirement of survival, which has universal implications. The establishment of food production requires specialized knowledge and skills. Dr. Muhsin Mahdi, who published an excellent philosophical study on Ibn Khaldun, reported that by nature, the human being is constantly thinking of how to fulfill all his needs in life. For this, he has to exercise his mental ability in order to find ways and means to survive and continue his life. As a consequence, this process gives birth to new sciences and crafts. According to Ibn Khaldun, knowledge of science and crafts can be obtained through several methods. They can be obtained through merely mental exercise, philosophy, development of new sciences and crafts from those who developed them earlier, or from the teachings of the prophets of God. It is from these sources that knowledge can be developed into a more systematic and specific set of sciences. Those who study Khaldun's writings from the modern worldview understand the great value of universal knowledge as it is applied to particular cultural issues. The various processes of acquiring knowledge are natural and must be understood as human rights. As Dr. Zaid Ahmed further writes, when the thinking faculty performs its function by nature, the process of acquiring knowledge takes place. Subsequently, knowledge and craft develop. This process is natural and in accordance with the logical order of the law of causality. Moreover, Ibn Khaldun explains, it is also in the nature of man that his thinking faculty provides a kind of desire and excitement in obtaining perceptions that he does not yet possess. This means that it is a requirement of nature that the thinking faculty in man performs its role to seek and obtain knowledge as well as production and industry. Khaldun proceeds to demonstrate how the process of obtaining knowledge develops. In order to obtain knowledge, man has recourse to those who precede him, those who have more knowledge than he, or he takes them from the earlier prophets. The human being has to exercise his thinking ability in order to find ways and means to survive and continue his life. This process results in the birth of new sciences and industries. Sciences and industries develop through several methods. They can be obtained from the earlier generation or from the teaching of the prophets of God, or they could be obtained as a result of perception, understanding, and observation of particular realities. This understanding of particular realities will be transformed into particular systemic sets of knowledge. This systemic and specific sets of knowledge are then transferred to the next generation by way of instruction and education. This represents one of the methods to development of science and industry. Ibn Khaldun concludes his argument by saying that the continuity of this process and its interconnection show clearly that knowledge and education is something natural in human life. This philosophy is built from the knowledge of the human being as a rational creature, inspired towards cooperation, creativity, and industry. All these elements are pillars of modern as well as ancient societies. Other articles describe Ibn Khaldun's view of education and teaching, which shed light on current issues of education. According to Khaldun, information should be given to students gradually in stages, lower to higher, which they may understand more easily. If teaching methods are gradually applied to students, the education will prove more effective for them. Initially, the main principles of information and science should be taught, taking into consideration the learning capacity of the students. At this stage, such a method will result in students showing more aptitude to the given information. However, the students' aptitude will remain weak and insufficient. According to Khaldun, it is harmful to be very strict on the student. During educating and teaching, it is harmful to be very strict to the student, especially if the student is of the young age. This sort of aggressiveness negatively influences the child. It may affect the psychology of the child and create unhappiness as well as corrupt the desire to work and study. This will drive the child to misbehavior and to lie out of fear. He will learn to display actions contrary to those readily within his heart. In time, this will become his nature and part of his character. It will corrupt the enhancement of social activity and undermine the whole meaning of humanity, consisting of self-esteem and family values. Therefore, teachers, mothers, and fathers should not be aggressive towards children in order to teach them obedience and manners. Khaldun wrote that traveling and conversing with scholars is useful for education. People sometimes learn knowledge, ethics, occupations, views, and virtues from teachers and also from persons who are masters in their field or simply others whom they accept as role models. Practical experience usually influences more concrete ideas on certain subjects. The more knowledgeable the teacher from whom information is gained, the more solid the information acquired by the student. Terminology of subjects usually complicates the learning process. This causes some people to assume that these terminologies are just part of the subject. Hearing the information from various masters shall strengthen his knowledge and assist him to differentiate between terminologies. Ibn Khaldun also emphasized the teaching of arts and crafts. He writes about the importance of the practical application, such as to observe, to feel, and to apply the knowledge gained as much as possible. He places emphasis on the fact that these sorts of subjects cannot specially be taught only in theory. He further states the theoretical study must be accompanied by practical study. He believed that learning science requires skill. Tradition is important in teaching. Tradition must be upheld for the progress of science. Otherwise, science and education will recede. Tradition of science and education only prevail in places which have progressed in prosperity. Ibn Khaldun has emphasized the importance of science and education. He envisioned science and education as inseparable to prosperity. The same is true today. According to Khaldun, the real difference between mankind and other beings is the power of thought. Science and art are born from open-minded thought and the intricate thinking and learning of the principles of all issues. Ideas emerge from those who have curiosity and desire to investigate what is unknown. He advises teachers to teach in a comprehensive manner and to gradually teach subjects in stages, moving from easier to more difficult. Memorization should be avoided. He emphasized teaching methods should be simple and not complicated. He states that the teaching of subjects should not be in broken sequences, or else the subject will become staggered and forgotten. And also, aggressive behavior towards children will turn them away from their lessons, create laziness, making them unwilling learners, as well as negatively affecting their behavior. Education should consist of theory and practice. Education should be revised and repeated until a good level is obtained. Khaldun also declares that learning and teaching the sciences requires skill, and that the teachers of these sciences should be knowledgeable in their fields. This clearly defines issues addressed by Ibn Khaldun are still relevant for educational issues in contemporary times. It is important for students to understand that American educators practice many of Khaldun's directives, but in the 14th century they were not so ubiquitous. Dr. Ibrahim Osweiss from Georgetown University of Qatar offers an illuminating article on the great philosopher entitled Ibn Khaldun, the Father of Economics. Dr. Osweiss says that Khaldun, the philosopher, laid down the foundation of different fields of knowledge, in particular the science of civilization. His significant contribution to economics, however, should place him in the history of economic thought as a major forerunner, if not the father of economics, a title which has been given to Adam Smith, whose great works were published some 370 years after Ibn Khaldun's death. Not only did Ibn Khaldun plant the germinating seeds of classical economics, whether in production, supply, or cost, but he also pioneered the study of consumption, demand, and utility, which are the cornerstones of modern economic theory. Before Ibn Khaldun, Plato presented, probably for the first time in writing, a crude account of the specialization and the division of labor. On the non-theoretical level, the ancient Egyptians used the technique of specialization, particularly in the era of the 18th dynasty, in order to save time and produce more work per hour. Following Plato, Aristotle proposed a definition of economics and considered the use of money in his analysis of exchange. His example of the use of a shoe for wear and for its use in exchange was later presented by Adam Smith as the value of use and the value in exchange. Another aspect of economic thought before Ibn Khaldun was that of the scholastics and of the Canaanites, who proposed placing economics within the framework of law based on religious and moral perceptions for the good of all human beings. Therefore, all economic activities were to be undertaken in accordance with such laws. Dr. Oswald writes, Ibn Khaldun was cognizant of the ideas relating to religion and moral perceptions. The relationship between moral and religious principles on one hand and good government on the other is effectively expounded in his citation and discussion of Tahir ibn al-Hussein, AD 775 to 822, famous letter to his son Abdullah, who ruled Khorasan with his descendants until AD 872. From the rudimentary thoughts of Tahir, Khaldun developed a theory of taxation which has affected modern economic thought and even economic policies in the United States and elsewhere. As part of this new science, Ibn Khaldun aimed to analyze objectively economic issues and to show the consequences of various policies. He thought that those things mandated by God can be shown scientifically to be the best social policies, and that this is the natural consequence of the fact that economic principles and the foundation of the good life were both created by God. These laws dictated that the state has certain limited functions: the defense of the community against injustice and aggression, the protection of private property, the prevention of fraud in exchange between citizens, to overseeing the mint of safeguard and the currency, and the wise exercise of political leadership. He denounced high taxation and government competition with the private sector because the lower productivity takes away from the incentive of people to work hard and ultimately ruin the state. In modern times, with high government spending and increased taxation, these principles are disregarded by present-day policymakers. Khaldun's views are supported by every major economist from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman. In the area of economics, his policy of moral and ethical law precedes practical application, so think before acting. In summary, modern students in America, if given the opportunity, can benefit for the study of the fundamentals of human integrity, education, economics, and industry as written in the Muqaddimah, written by Ibn Khaldun, called The Introduction to History. In this celebrated book, he informs us of the defining characteristic of humanity as rational creatures. This great philosopher declared thinking and cooperation as necessary for human survival. The social framework for cooperation is as relevant today as it was in the 14th century. He establishes with clarity that ethics and moral law should precede education, economics, and industry. His basic adherence to the divine imperative placed on all people make him important to a generation who may have forgotten that moral excellence matter in all areas of human achievement. This 14th century philosopher is still relevant in a time of growing uncertainty in America. Wall Street financial institutions failed because of mismanagement and greed. American manufacturers abandoned their employees for extreme profits in other countries. The American educational system is non-responsive to future needs of the society. Our family values are in need of revival. Religious institutions are overwhelmed. Yes, Khaldun is indeed an important scholar, a beacon of light for the modern readers who are interested in how ideas and positive action matters in the establishment of a healthy society.